Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. Very excited about the topic that we're going to be talking about. My name's Felicity Hassan. I run two businesses out of New York. One is called Audits. We're an executive search firm that looks to level the playing field for diverse talent. So really focused on making sure that everyone has an opportunity in the workplace. And the second is Involve, which is an advisory business looking to drive inclusion for our clients. So once that diversity is hired into your organization, really kind of helping you to keep it. So today, I really wanted to welcome our speakers. We're incredibly lucky to have them here today. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I'm going to ask them to tell us about the business that they work for, what they cover within that business, and just something funny about themselves. So to kick off and just to kind of make sure that I am not giving that awkward task to them and not taking it on myself, I'll start off with my pronouns. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And my funny fact that I was sharing with the group beforehand is now we live in this remote environment. We're all trying to sort of juggle the concept of like being at home and family and all being in a confined space. So I have the printer in my office, and every time my husband wants to use it, rather than just walking into the room and getting it, he will occasionally come in and creep along the floor like a little mouse in order to get things off the printer, which is a bit farcical because I think we've all been on calls at this point where somebody's barging into the room behind, but it keeps me enormously entertained. So if during this conversation you hear my door open, you can imagine that there's a small human like worming their way into the room. It's either my children or my husband. So that's me. Over to the panel. Rebecca, do you want to kick us off?
Sure thing. Hi, so I'm Rebecca Sharpe, she, her, hers. I'm with Publicis Groupe and I'm working on an AI platform called Marcel, and I lead out the data science and analytics function there globally. Yeah, thinking of a funny fact, I was trying to think of one for me. Normally I don't go online shopping, but I think I've been needing a bit of an outlet. And I've been buying, I don't know what's got into me, shoes. Where am I going to wear shoes in the middle of COVID? If I get another delivery of shoes, I'm going to have to slap myself. But yeah, so that's probably my funny fact there.
Thank you. Ramya, what about you? Oh, from mute.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ramya Raghavendra. I work as a research scientist at IBM Research in New York. And I mostly work on advancing the science around creating trust in AI. And I also co-lead the Science for Social Good program we have in IBM Research. Funny, I go by the pronouns she and her. And funny fact, I may have changed into my running clothes when my husband's video conference was on at one point. I may have. And it's, yeah, I won't confirm or deny that. Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Khadija, on to you. I know you've been looking forward to sharing a funny fact with us.
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. I work for Microsoft, and I'm part of our AI and research group, which is basically where we bring AI tech together with product engineering and where we take cutting edge AI and take it to market. I lead our partner ecosystem development in that space. And I'm typically based in New York City, but at the moment I'm sheltering in place elsewhere. And I'm, in terms of I guess a funny fact one could say, which I would never usually publicly admit to, but I'm a huge health fanatic when it comes to healthy food, but I have something like 6 gallons of ice cream in the freezer that I've been hoarding, thinking I don't know when the next delivery is going to come. And shamefully, I'm eating all of it.
Excellent. Excellent. And Adrianne?
Hi, I'm Adrianne Pettiford. I lead client insights and analytics within our data science function at Pymetrics. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And in that function, what we do at Pymetrics is make sure that all of the Pymetrics products are fair. So prior to joining Pymetrics, I worked at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission leading investigative analytics. In Pymetrics, what we do is we use machine learning to develop behavioral science-based tools to help guide decisions around selection and the employee life cycle. So promotions, repositioning folks into different roles. My fun fact is that I have historically been working remotely prior to COVID-19 stay-at-home orders. And so I am glad that everyone shares in the joys of being at home. And like Felicity, I have had plenty of those scenarios where a door creaked open behind me and a human was crawling on the floor to get something.
Thank you very much. So we're all adjusting to this crazy overexposure of inviting people into our living rooms. Today, this is all very pertinent stuff, and I'm actually thrilled that we're actually able to present this program in a digital format, because look, technology and AI is crafting the way that we live, work, and create, and perhaps more now than ever, now that we're all at home. So today, our panel is going to be sharing how they're adjusting in response to the pandemic, along with kind of their cutting edge thoughts on what AI can do to create a more inclusive future for us all. So that's going to be the theme of our conversation today. So without further ado, let me kick off with the first question. So it's commonplace for people to use AI in their everyday life, but not fully recognize it. I am certainly one of those individuals, I have no doubt. I think it would be helpful for our audience here today to explain what AI is, and give us some kind of creative response. So Ramya, I'm going to start with you on that, but I would love to hear your input from all of the panel on this.
Sure. I think when people hear the word artificial intelligence, their mind goes to, I don't know, bots taking over the world, or cyborgs and things like that. I want to say that there's a whole spectrum of technology when we talk about artificial intelligence. A lot of it is quite benign, in the sense that we look at a lot of data we look at historic data and try to gain insights in order to influence our future decisions. It could be as simple as looking at your photos on Google Photos or Facebook and being able to recognize who these faces are and being able to say this person is the same as this person. So really cool thing that it's now able to do is track my daughter's growth. So it's able to recognize that her when she was 6 months old and 2 years old. So it's learning how people age by looking at lots of other photos of people. It could be applications that, you know, decide if you're eligible for a bank loan, or and so there's that spectrum of things. And then you start adding more intelligence. So then you start thinking about robots which are able to make decisions based on what they've learned. And finally, you have augmented intelligence, where you provide essentially augmenting a machine with human level intelligence. You're talking about conversational systems that can, where machines can interact with a human without the human themselves not recognizing if they're interacting with a human or a machine. You may all have talked to chatbots in your banking applications or so on. A lot of that comes from understanding natural language and using AI to converse with people. So there's those whole spectrum of applications in which some form of machine learning or artificial intelligence is used.
Fantastic, that's really helpful. I never thought about it in the context of Google Photos, so you just giving it that context is really useful. Rebecca, Khadija, Adrianne, any other kind of thoughts in terms of like what AI is, to really kind of bring it to life for everyone here?
Thinking of AI and the human characteristics that it brings day to day, like, and it's something we talked a little bit about the other day, is like, you know, in journalism, we see it there, and other use cases, writing perhaps, you know, columns. We spoke about sports and baseball, where there's cases where typical colloquialisms are being used to write columns to then sort of, I guess, feed the journalism more quickly. So when you read the column, it's using words that you're familiar with. You wouldn't realize it's not a real journalist. So that's one area that I'm seeing AI be used more and more. And music as well. We see music. I believe Australia just won an award for AI actually with some dance music just last night before, yeah. So that's, some interesting areas that I've been watching in the realms of AI. Within Marcel, the platform we have for Publicis Groupe, we use it a lot for the search function, which we'll probably go into a little bit more later, and for matching people to opportunities and things like that. Helping to make life easier for them.
Great. Okay, so it's widely understood that the people who create, and I'm thrilled that we have an all-female panel, incidentally, with intersectional diversity here, because the general kind of perception is that the individuals who train the technology that AI is built around are largely white and male. So what efforts are you making within your organization to ensure that your programmers incorporate culture and inclusive dimensions of diversity from the start where AI is being implemented? Adrianne, what's Pymetrics looking at to try and implement changes?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And one of the issues that I think a lot of folks deal with, not just on the side of who is building the algorithms, but what's going into an algorithm. So it's garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're looking to increase diversity, then you ought to ensure that you have diversity in your training set. And so machine learning, artificial intelligence really has kind of two different classes for those of us who are now forced to be stay-at-home parents. Maybe you'll appreciate this analogy. You can think of it as supervised and unsupervised. Unsupervised might be a scenario where you could introduce your child to a concept or something new, like a dog. Here's a dog, and the child is interacting in the world and goes out and sees, instead of the German Shepherd that you showed her the first time, maybe she sees a poodle, but she's able to say, oh, that is a dog. Supervised learning would say, here is a picture of all different types of dogs. There's a German Shepherd, there's a poodle, there's a pug. They are all dogs. You've labeled that information. So when we think about those two different classes, it's important to make sure that whatever we're feeding our algorithms, we're giving them something that's representative. So in the labels situation, you want lots of breeds represented. But in an unlabeled situation, what you have to keep an eye on is making sure that that algorithm has exposure to different types of breeds and is learning correctly. And that's where auditing comes in. Pymetrics specifically actually takes the proactive stance of debiasing and auditing all of our models before they go live. What that means is our data scientists who build the models have to demonstrate using a diverse and representative test set that the models they have built will not adversely impact anyone on the basis of race or gender. And I think that's a strategy that more companies should be leveraging, and also looking at things like doing external auditing to make sure that you are enforcing and upholding the best practices with regards to ethics and fairness in AI.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant. Khadija, anything that you would have to offer there in the context of how Microsoft is dealing with that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and there's multiple angles that we should look at it that I think is important. It's all too easy to say, you know what, let's increase our diversity and inclusion hiring, and I think a lot of the companies out there are trying to do that. It's really important to put it on metrics of executives, because you do have to have some accountability and scorecarding, and I think effort's there. But the challenge is the switch doesn't get turned on overnight, right? And this is a broader issue, quite frankly, not just for AI, but tech in general. When you think about, girls in engineering professions, etc. So I think what happens is, until then, what do you do? I mean, is it enough for companies to say we've got diverse hiring practices, etc., we're putting them into place, but then we end up waiting years until you reach critical mass, which we know we haven't, right? So it's a multi-pronged approach, and obviously Microsoft, probably like other companies out there, puts a lot of effort in terms of diverse hiring, etc. But when you think about these teams as well, right? When you are the only diverse candidate joining an engineering team, a lot of people don't like to be in an environment that's not supportive. So I know when I've been talking to some of my colleagues on the engineering side, they really talk about allyship. Because even if you yourself might not be a diverse candidate, you have to make sure that you're, enabling or opening that room up for the ones who are there, so that you can really compound the effect of that work being done. Because if you end up being 1 out of a team of 40, 2 out of a team of whatever, 10, it's really not sufficient. You need to get to something like north of a 30% number for that to make a difference. The other thing I would say is, again, Microsoft being one of the big tech companies, it takes a lot of accountability in terms of how do we also think about our own principles. So I'm like part of an engineering or a product team that's building product, right? Building product that's then going to get used by the marketplace. And it's kind of if you think about it, there's a little bit of an ethical dilemma there too, because as a big tech company, you don't want to impose your perspectives. But at the same time, you want to show your customers and your partners that there's principles you're upholding yourselves towards. So long story short, within Microsoft, we had something called Ether, which is a committee that actually reports into the CEO and his directs, which talks about engineering, AI and ethics and engineering principles. And they look at things like, sensitive use cases, because we also don't want to be in a situation where our technology is being utilized questionably in areas that maybe we don't support, especially where we have a say, right? The other thing is we're doing a lot of research and making tools available to customers and the ecosystem to make sure that the algorithms they're creating, right? So if you're a customer, you have to have your own independence and freedom in terms of how you're building that tech. In fact, you can't put the onus just on the companies building the products. It's how are you consuming it as an entity, and being able to test those algorithms for bias, right? Because sometimes it's unintended. It's not that someone's sitting there saying, today, let me figure out how I can make my algorithm as unfair as possible. It's sometimes people don't even realize that.
Yeah.
So we actually have created some very interesting tools where you can create an algorithm and then test it to sort of say, how biased is this, right? And basically empower our customers and partners to also take accountability for how that technology gets used.
I think, this is something which we'll touch on, as we continue the conversation, and it's extremely useful to kind of hear how the various different organizations are working with this, because I think the auditing and the testing is going to be so important as we continue the conversation. As I say, I know that we're going to kind of touch on that again later on. But if I think about like the logical sort of continuation of that point is the human element as well. So if we think about like the makeup of our team, where bias is less likely, to your point, Khadija, there are many kind of unfair elements of technology that were not in any way intentional. It was just something which hadn't necessarily been considered because you weren't necessarily part of the community that was impacted by a bias. So bias is less likely to occur when the people programming your AI have a real stake in the outcomes, presumably. So have a real sense of, what it feels like to be impacted by bias. So how do we as leaders ensure that our teams take responsibility for how their work will be used on a human level? I know that Rebecca over at Marcel, you had a perspective that you were eager to share on that.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the beginning and the end of these models and these algorithms. In my team, like there's such a diversity. There's like South Africa, Israel, India, Montenegro, Australia, Peru, such a diversity and different identities and different age ranges across. And I think, when we're brainstorming what the beginning could look like and then validating at the end, bringing those minds together is critical, and checking and peer reviewing each other's work. Otherwise, we can accidentally bring things in, or we just don't think of things. I remember there was a cosmetics client I was working for, and it was doing image recognition, basically foundation matching for skin, all done through the camera. And we had to think of so many different things, different tones, different lights, all the rest of it. And, we thought we got to the end to this fantastic model, the results were going to be great. And then bearing in mind it's a female product, typically, somebody just fresh out of university, a male, turned around and said, well, you should actually be validating by using facial expressions at the end when they get the match. Are they happy? Are they not? Because it's a global indicator. So bringing those sorts of people and thinking in is critical all along the way there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and presumably a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, like when we're thinking about these technology, I think it's all about kind of exploring all the various different perspectives that we can take, which kind of comes into the humanity of this. How can we use AI to really impact humanity in a positive way? I think, again, when we think about this in the context of where we are today and, the challenges that we're facing with the COVID-19 crisis, how can we really be using AI to impact humanity? Ramya. Oh.
So yeah, we've been asking ourselves the same question. We've been doing research on AI for a while now. How can we pivot and use these technologies for the good of humanity in general, but also at a time when there's this huge pandemic which has sort of taken over people's lives worldwide. What we have been doing is sort of looking at the entire spectrum of things that AI could help in various ways. So let me give you an example. First is we want to first educate people about what's the current events, what's the news, what is real, what is not. So curating and being and giving access to current and correct information was a huge step that needed to be done. And there's various projects that look at whether it's news articles or social media, or actual reports that governments are putting out, being able to curate all this information and getting sense out of that, because you want to summarize it. And if somebody asks a question, you should be able to answer a question based on what those curated facts are. So that's one thing that we've been looking at. The other is there's a lot of work on discovering drugs for diseases. So discovering drugs is a very long, if you look at the vaccine process, it's a very long drawn out process. It can take several years. So the question, general question that is currently intriguing the AI community is, how can artificial intelligence speed up this process? Can we use both artificial intelligence algorithms along with high performance computing in order to make this faster? So there's a lot of work around, can we look at what properties are needed? Can we use computing to make this discovery easier? And that's something that we are doing. There's work on essentially, can we look at all the research that has already been done and identify if some drugs can be repurposed for this? And you're hearing a lot of medical research already going on around various drugs that can be repurposed. What we are looking at is not medical studies that are currently ongoing, but can we look at the past and say, what are the characteristics of drugs that people have looked? It's called a meta-analysis, where you essentially ask AI to read 100,000 research publications that have been already put out and ask you to summarize the content so that you can now give this to an expert and say, hey, look, I think these are some potential candidates. So you're using AI to augment human intelligence, something that was not easily doable. So these are some examples of how we are using COVID, using AI in order to advance the research that hopefully will help mitigate the COVID crisis sooner than later.
Which is incredibly encouraging, because certainly expediting our route out of this and our path forward is so important. So the knowledge that AI and technology is really going to expedite that is incredibly encouraging. And if we think about that in the context of the broader opportunities and responsibilities with AI as citizens, I mean, I think that is definitely a key example of how we can use this technology, how we can use AI to really kind of drive change. In terms of the opportunities and responsibilities, it's great to hear how IBM have picked that up. Khadija, what would you say were your kind of broader thoughts on those opportunities and responsibilities?
Yeah, so, for me, probably the most exciting part of being in this space is the opportunity to impact humanity positively. Now, obviously, anything that's positive can be used in a negative way, democracy, nuclear weapons, you name it. But I think what's really important is for us to think about the potential. So one of the things that really excites me is, along the lines of what's happening with COVID-19 and all the opportunities to kind of impact the here and now, We have an initiative called AI for Good at Microsoft, and it's one that I'm pretty, again, when I think about what inspires me, we're basically putting both money, so it's something like $165 million over the next 5 years, but also expertise, know-how, and resources towards helping the community. And when I say community, this is individuals, startups, organizations that have ideas to be able to impact AI in the space of, we call it AI for Earth, for accessibility, humanitarian action, right? Think about displaced people and refugees, being able to maintain cultural heritage, as well as health, of course. And one of the examples I liked, Ramya, since you talked about COVID, I'm going to choose a different space, but one that we actually, you can actually download it on an iPhone, is an application called Seeing AI. And what was particularly interesting about this one is it was actually built by a visually impaired software engineer who was part of the team. So it was a research project, right? So this isn't one that requires a big company with big resources. And for him, it was always important that how could he take a technology, and when he's sort of walking down the street on a daily basis, it reads text, it recognizes images, it even looks at things like sentiment analysis. Now, how many of us are presenting, and if we didn't have video, sometimes you're on a conference call and you're like, I have no idea how the people are reacting to my presentations. So when you're visually impaired, you're kind of in that situation 24/7. And it's amazing how he's used that to sort of gauge people's reactions, and just imagine how it's changed a person's life in terms of how they, engage with family, their children, as well as in the business scenario. So I think the potential is endless, because in each of these categories, there's so much that can be done. And this is where I would emphasize the citizen element, because many of us are wearing our business hats. And of course, from a corporate business perspective, there's tons that needs to be done. But the message that I would really give to people is, as citizens, we have a very important role to play. I often find people saying, oh, well, this technology, I don't understand, I'm not a programmer. By the way, you don't just have to be a programmer to get involved. Obviously, going in and shaping the algorithms and creating, fantastic, and one should. But especially when you think about, responsible AI, the ethical questions that get raised, we actually need expertise from a cross-section of society. So this is where, as individuals, we have an opportunity to play an active role. And if you simply want to be someone who's like, well, that's still all work, but what does it mean for me as a citizen? How do you actually partake in society's legislation and governance around this? Because AI, regardless of how people feel about it, it's here to stay. So we can either be victims of it, or we can proactively play roles. And I think about 2 months ago, middle of March, Washington State actually launched a historic, the governor there signed a historic legislation regarding the use of facial recognition, because we know that, that's the one at the forefront of the biases. And it's actually, it's got a lot of different elements of it, but it is helping to regulate things like civil liberties. It's a start, right? And obviously there was proactive involvement in doing that. And if we don't play a part in it, right now it's the only state that I'm aware of, like just speaking about the US. So there's an opportunity that all of us can play in our communities with our governments globally to sort of start shaping what this looks like.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, that kind of brings us to a really important point, which is the quality assurance and the governance part of this. Because you say, as we talk about humanity, as we talk about responsibility, I would say the organizations that I've worked for, probably their biggest concern was the governance side, and the processes and checkpoints, and what they should be thinking about as an organization when kind of bringing this AI in-house. What should companies be looking to use these technologies? What should they be thinking about in the context of like minimizing risk? Adrianne, any thoughts from what Pymetrics are thinking about there?
Sure. I think one of the interesting things when we're talking about policy and legislation to raise is that really legislation is way behind the curve here. We're dealing with tools and technology that have been around a lot longer than legislators maybe have been thinking about them, and they've affected our lives very broadly already. And there's really only a handful of states that have really begun to pass law and legislation in this area, some specifically related to video and facial recognition, others just around machine learning and more narrowly defined in terms of hiring. So one of the things to think about is what is the conversation that we're having with policymakers. And so Pymetrics is actively involved in kind of supporting policymakers, for example, who don't have the machine learning and the data science background, who need some folks who are subject matter experts to inform them in ways that help them determine whether or not legislation is appropriate or headed in the right direction. Because to be fair, our lawmakers have to be generalists. And while they may have backgrounds in certain areas, we can't expect them all to understand the nuances of machine learning in a way that really might be required to best scope out legislation. From the perspective of what we can do, even while we're waiting on legislation to keep up, I think there remains, several different bodies of researchers and scientists and subject matter experts who maintain knowledge that's very useful in thinking about fairness. And whatever the technology is meant to augment or improve, we really should look at the traditional subject matter experts in those areas to understand what are the issues of fairness that they had when their processes were manual and not automated, because those same concerns are going to remain. It's just now, instead of having a human being work through decision making manually, you're now automating that and having an algorithm make a decision for you. So you're still going to be concerned about fairness in the same ways. So bringing in those non-data scientist experts in the subject matter, HR professionals when we're talking about selection, if we're talking about education, then teachers and educational professionals. But also when we think about this issue of risk, it's important to couple and partner with attorneys. And that ends up being a very interesting partnership and marriage. So when I've spoken with groups at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I often ask folks who were there either from a legal or an HR perspective to raise their hand and say, how many of you have spent a substantial amount of time having conversations with data scientists? And very few raise their hands. But we're building out tools that are still governed and guided by the same legal concerns and considerations that our businesses have. And so really it's this interdisciplinary approach that needs to take place, where we have legal representatives, where we have data scientists, and then we have the subject matter experts in the room all talking about these issues and looking at risk from different ways. That way we can look at the solutions to mitigate risk in different ways. And I think what we'll find is we'll start doing things like having accessibility audits to have folks come in and say, can this tool be used very broadly by folks of all different ability levels? And if not, what can we do to tweak it? Making sure that those individuals who are building these tools are assessing how well they perform before they go live in the real world. One of the things that Pymetrics has done is open sourced our Audit.AI tool, which is one of the ways that can be done. So I really think it's a multi-pronged approach that is going to address this issue of quality assurance and risk mitigation.
And would the broader group agree with that? I'd be interested in whether or not the rest of you have thoughts on that, because I think what Adrianne's saying makes a lot of sense in terms of having a team of subject matter experts from multiple different angles come in to opine on the various kind of risks of manual versus the automated version. It would be great to kind of hear from the broader group. Is that how you've done it within your organizations as well?
Yeah, actually, I should give some more context on what Marcel is, and I can chat a little bit more to that as well. So Marcel is an AI app that is owned by Publicis Groupe. Publicis Groupe is one of the largest media groups within the world. And Marcel.AI is basically an app that's used internally to connect up the network of people. And to Adrianne's point, we work closely with a global network of lawyers to make sure that we're conforming to GDPR and CCPA. COPPA doesn't touch into our world, but we meet regularly. Every single cookie that goes down is done with thorough scoping through it to make sure we're not just putting a cookie down, capturing data for data's sake, and opening up to risk. That's not even part of what we do, which is great from having those minds. So I definitely agree with that, having that global network there and the lawyers involved with the SMEs. I know for us, GDPR seems to be the stronger one, especially when you compare it to some of the laws closer to home. So we apply that through, so everybody gets the same level of protection and treatment, which is fantastic. And that's all laid out in the privacy policy. one thing we're conscious of as well is with GDPR, there's Article 17, I think it is, which is like right of erasure, to have your data removed upon request. So we take this really seriously, and I encourage other brands, businesses, etc., to do that out there. And it's having, as a person goes through their anonymous touch points with your brand, if they do invoke Article 17, for example, you need to pull that data back, and you need to be able to get every touch point that they had. This is their right. You need to have that there. So making sure that structure's in place. But at the same time, for your models, you want to make sure that it doesn't disrupt, your training sets, for example. So having a plan there to maybe replicate or add some noise is also a tip I'd have there for people.
That's extremely useful context. Sorry, Khadija, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I would add that it's very important to have a cross-section of expertise represented, even going towards when you think about academia and research, nonprofit organizations, right? Governments, as well as bodies of other industry. Because if we don't all, like for example, we can't get into a situation, we need third-party standards, right? So that's another thing that we've done at Microsoft, which is making sure our developers and et cetera are going through, looking at the third-party sort of testing standards that are available out there, and making sure that the technology you're putting out kind of is, I don't want to call it compliant, but goes through that. And then having that cross-section, because what's happening right now, since we're still relatively nascent, you're going to find different, like especially the bigger tech companies, they recognize that it's an opportunity to be, I don't want to call it a role model, but to sort of set the tone. How we work together with this cross-section of companies and public and private sector becomes very important, because you don't want to be in a situation in the future where it becomes one person's standard versus the other, right? And then how it mixes in with private life. So I think that's critical. The other thing is also making sure that, I touched on this earlier, but I think it's a very important point, is how our customers and citizens take responsibility themselves. Because it's sort of like you're in a restaurant, you're going to be handed a plate of something, right? But if something isn't looking good, and you kind of can't end up eating it and saying, well, it's their fault. So I think shared accountability, I think about the time, over a decade ago, if you were working with big companies and signing deals, they voted where they put their money where their mouth was. So if you were like a woman-owned business, there would be additional discounts or incentives, or they would only sign contracts of certain types. So at the other end of the equation, there were demands being made, which meant industry can move faster, because it's all of a sudden, in order for your technology to be accepted, it has to go through these principles, for example, right? And we have something called like the Office of Responsible AI internally, because we don't want to just be a mouthpiece and talk about things, because it's very easy to talk about principles, but how do you test your own engineering and sales teams against those? Right, so our principles include things like fairness, inclusivity, etc., measuring them and then holding folks accountable, so that at the end of the day, if you happen to be, a white male who's in that, you can't ding that person for being what they are as well, but what you can do is make sure that that person is educated in the challenges and responsibility for what the technology that they're developing, what the potential impact is. So it kind of has to happen from all these different dimensions for real change to occur.
Yeah, I think that's. I think that when we think about the challenge, the responsibility, the accountability, it all kind of, in many respects, it sort of filters through to what has largely been the elephant in the room when we talk about AI, which is this concept that AI might replace basic human functions in certain areas. So we were looking at some studies in the lead up to this, and there was a Vice study that showed that while Gen Z agreed that AI will reduce some jobs, 90% of the people in that study actually believed that it would also create jobs that don't exist today. And 76% of that audience felt like it would drive an efficiency which would reduce the hours worked, which would in turn sort of increase quality of life. So I think that, it's fantastic to hear that from a Gen Z population, but obviously that's kind of the new generation coming into the workplace. So it's good to know that there's a group of individuals coming in that really see the opportunity here. But at the moment, AI is dependent on human input. Does the narrative that AI will replace human functions still ring true for you? And if so, what implication could that have for those entering the workforce post COVID-19. Khadija, I'd like you to expand on that, and then I'd be interested to know what the broader group thinks.
So, we've been through these cycles in life before, whether it's the steam engine, telegraph, telephone, television, you name it, right? Each time humans have progressed, I think there would be a subset of us that might want to go back in time, but I think generally speaking, we've been inching towards a certain type of development that's made lives easier, at least in one dimension, right? So I think what's important is that yes, AI is definitely going to change the workforce and the workspace. The kind of jobs that we're going to expect to see in the next 5-10 years is going to be very different than today. Some of our roles are absolutely going to become irrelevant. And I think as citizens, this goes back to my point, making ourselves aware of that. And that's not, by the way, just an AI statement. That's as we progress statement, right? Manufacturing jobs started going overseas, even if they existed. I mean, there were states that were in the US significantly impacted. So the point is, things will happen. How do you want your life to play out, right? So it's being aware. Unlike any time in history, we have the ability to retool and re-educate ourselves online. You don't have to go to a 4-year college and pay whatever it is these days, $250,000 or what have you, right? So there's opportunity for people, because the reality is you can't go back and learn about something that's so cutting edge, because by the time you come out of it, your information is actually going to be old and stale. So this is a time where actually coursework, getting internships, really rolling up your sleeves to try different things has become easier than ever. The other thing is, me personally, I truly believe in the human AI partnership. The challenge we have is there's so many videos and so much negative press about AI overtaking because we keep competing with AI, right? AI can compete on game X and Y. I think if we start realizing that it's a partnership and AI is going to help me take out the robotic elements of my mundane work so that I can spend more time doing high value activities, maybe spending more time with my family, maybe spending more time using my brain in a creative way. I think that I would encourage people to think that way. Because regardless of singularity, this concept that human machine are going to meld, or rather machines going to become more intelligent than humans, yes, it might very well be out there. We're still a ways away from it. So there's a journey in the middle, and there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And, there's no right or wrong answer in it. But for example, we talk about advancements of AI in healthcare. Radiologists, you can figure out a cancer tumor faster with an AI algorithm than you can by a radiologist. But the reality is, even within those professions, there will be automation that's going to help what we do. There's going to be automation which might take something away, and there will be automation that'll create new jobs. So there isn't a single field. I wouldn't take it as a black and white approach, but definitely cases where you have to use creativity, right? To use your mind in that space, where there's imagination involved. So think about writers, teachers, where the nuances of human engagement and interpersonal connection, because machines still, they're not good at that. They haven't gotten good at that. Will we live in a sci-fi age where that might happen? It may very well, but I would use more time, or I would use less time worrying about it and more time trying to figure out how can I reskill myself. And this goes back to the earlier point. If you sort of say, listen, I don't want to build algorithms and go back to school and get a PhD, and it looks like that's all people in AI land do, you have this profession, or this broader profession, is going to need people from every walk of life. Just think about being a psychologist, a sociologist. We talked about ethicists. I don't have a computer science or a PhD in sort of like an AI background per se, but I'm in an AI product team. So I think we just need to rethink about how we can get involved and not see it as something that's going to take anything away from us.
That's a fantastic point. Any kind of parting thoughts before we move into questions, which I'm eager to do so that we can hear from this group? Ramya, Adrianne, Rebecca, any kind of parting thoughts for us on that?
So I'm in, you'd sort of say a creative industry, technically being media agencies and all the rest of it. And I mean, I'm a little bit like Khadija. I started out as, in the world of right brain. Then I developed a love of numbers in my 30s, just sit quietly there. So I've kind of switched over from the creatives to the science. And, the one thing I encourage, people in similar positions as well is to definitely go out and learn. It is possible. It's at your fingertips now. And, in my world of creativity, there's always been this long battle amongst, the creatives with the design, and then you've got the data scientists coming like, here's the numbers, this is what your design should do. But now, definitely in the last year, I'm seeing something called computational design coming to the forefront more so. So that is where these two worlds do intersect with each other. So you've got people who are from engineering backgrounds now doing big advertising campaigns and bringing that through. So that's one thing I'm enjoying, seeing those worlds starting to blend more and more.
Fantastic. And quickly from Ramya.
Yeah, just to give another perspective from what Khadija, and which I agree with everything you said, Khadija, and from a perspective of somebody who does have a PhD and does AI algorithms all day, I also have to say that there is so much that is left to do. We feel like we have barely touched the surface of what can be done in any area application of AI that we look at. We feel like there's so much that could be improved. A lot of data labeling, what Adrianne was talking about earlier, is done by hand. We need humans to feed into artificial intelligence algorithms. We need humans to provide inputs to and make a decision, because even if you tell a radiologist this is a tumor, there is so much nuances around it that AI cannot be the final decision maker at this point anytime soon. And finally, how do we take AI algorithms and graphs and have it make sense to a non-technical person? And that sort of design aspect is so new, and people are just starting to think about it. I can show you metrics that make sense to a data scientist. This has accuracy, this has precision, this has recall, but what does any of that mean to a radiologist or an educationist? So how do we make sense in a real world, whatever the algorithms are spitting out? So these are all huge questions that we are looking at, and there's a lot of work left to be done.
Fantastic. And Adrianne, just final parting thought?
Yes, so along those same lines, I came to this world from a different background. So I'm a PhD psychologist by training, and come to this with the lens of thinking about fairness. And so just as we've seen in other technological developments, we see kind of new professions that crop up around it. So if you think about the advent of the telephone, no one was really thinking that would not crop up a whole host of companies that would need service, customer service support, phone books, things like that. Of course, it sped up the way we communicated. It wasn't just by telegraph. The telegraph died, but look at all of these other jobs and opportunities that cropped up around to support this new technology. And I think along those lines, we have to think about who are the individuals that are going to keep an eye on, once these products and tools are developed, are they accessible to all individuals, or very broadly accessible to those who need them? So especially in the context of operating within a pandemic, as things have shifted, folks have had to switch to more technological ways of communicating with individuals. And I think there is a space for artificial intelligence to help us identify pockets of populations that are at great risk of not having access to the tools that we're developing and deploying. So when we think about all sorts of data that are publicly available and that are already collected, think about the mass surveys that keep an eye on who has internet access and telephone access. Algorithms can be used to help us make predictions in advance of pandemics, to say who are the individuals who are going to be cut off from access to tools that will keep the world running as we need it to, and then be able to come up with a plan to help get resources to those individuals that otherwise would be cut off from them.
Incredibly useful. And as I say, I'm just so grateful that we had already planned to do this event, and my thanks go to Publicis for supporting us and hosting what was initially going to be an in-person event to have this conversation, and as I say, became more and more pertinent as we entered this quarantine period. So on that note, I really want to thank the panelists, Adrianne, Khadija, Ramya, Rebecca, just incredible insight, and really kind of brought this subject to life for us. So I want to flip now over to some questions. So in this format, I would encourage people to pop questions into the chat box. You also have a raise hand function, and Park will be keeping an eye out for any questions that come up that we'd like to explore. And I believe that Mimi is going to be doing some polling. So I will hand over to Park and Mimi.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm just going through some of the questions here. I'm going to send us over. Looks like John has a good question. If you want to read that out.
So we saw that male identifying applicants for the Apple credit card were in some cases receiving significantly higher credit limits than female identifying applicants. Apple and Goldman Sachs came out and said, hey, we don't even ask people about their gender identity when applying. Clearly there was bias in the data they used to train their models. If you're looking at fairness in the terms of gender, sexual orientation, and intersectionality of identities, do you then have to collect that data in order to detect and mitigate bias? While we may not use intersectional identities in predictions, how can we use it better in bias mitigation?
I'd like to respond to that one. I think it's a very interesting point, especially when we're thinking about finances or employment, because these are very heavily regulated spaces, and sometimes it's illegal to collect some of those pieces of information that you're talking about. And so would I say that you have to always collect the information? Not necessarily from the people who you're making a decision about. So one of the benefits of developing algorithms is that you can test them out on a known data set. So you may not have the gender, sexuality, orientation information on individuals that are applying for credit cards, but you may develop that algorithm and then have a set of individuals for whom you know that information. And then you test your algorithm in that known set, that labeled set, and you look to see whether or not you will see any bias. It is, of course, kind of an approximation of the world, which is why it's important to make sure that it's a representative one, meaning you have sufficient diversity that reflects the population you'll use that algorithm on. So you don't necessarily have to collect the data from the people you're making the decision on, but in order to really pre-audit things, you should have a set of data where that information is known. And that's really one of the best practices in testing before you go live. And then, of course, repeatedly testing on the back end so that you know that things are still operating fairly.
That's really useful. Anybody else from the panel want to speak to that question? Okay, Park, anything else jump out from the questions coming through, or anyone raising their hand?
No raised hands yet, but we do have some of the poll results if Mimi wants to go through that, just to kind of give us a little pulse on where people are at.
Sure. Thank you, Park. So about 38 of you voted, which is about like 50%, I would say. And for the #1 question, overall with regards to technology, AI in the future, are you an optimist, a pessimist, or is it complicated? We have a whopping 66% of folks that are an optimist, which is good. We have no pessimists in the midst, so that's even better. And then 34% of you said that it's complicated. I happen to fall in that it's complicated area, so I get it. Question #2, does your company currently have any AI projects underway? 61% of you said yes. 11% said no, and then 29% of you were unsure. That's a wrap, folks. I'll let Park take it back as we have some questions here.
Great, thanks. So I know that Adrianne, you had talked a little bit also about the example with the picture, and there was a follow-up that was a bit similar to the example that was asked earlier, where, you know, what if that person was a police officer or somebody who had a lot of power, authority to kind of have influence over somebody else's life? Like, how would AI work with something like that?
So I think from the perspective of policing, we are already seeing artificial intelligence used. In fact, folks who may have been paying attention to some issues with, I think they're the doorbell cameras and facial recognition algorithms. We see it on not just the local police level, but also federal law enforcement agencies that may be doing some surveillance. So in those instances, we do in fact see the usage of these tools with facial recognition, unfortunately being developed without very diverse training sets. And then what happens is they have disproportionately high rates of predicting negative outcomes for women and people of color. From that perspective, I mean, that's one of those things where if we had gone in with much more diverse training set, probably an outcome we would not have seen. Similarly, there are algorithms that judges are using to help inform decisions about whether or not someone should be released from prison on parole, or whether a decision should be made to give a lesser or more harsh sentencing based on prediction on whether someone will reoffend. Unfortunately, again, we see scenarios where these algorithms have been determined to disproportionately suggest that people of color and some women will reoffend more likely, all other things being equal. And we find that their use of them has been deployed prematurely prior to testing. From the perspective of policing on an individual level, though, it's challenging because we use artificial intelligence in the way that we can to replace humans, but person-to-person policing is probably one of those practices and occupations that's going to be very difficult to, in live interactions, influence with the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. Though I do think that with the use of equipping police officers with body cameras, there is a way to take that data and learn from it and hopefully inform some sorts of training, procedures, policies, and practices that might improve policing.
Thank you so much. Okay, and without further ado, I know that you will all have things to run off to. So I wanted to thank our speakers again. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation and really, really useful. So thank you very much for giving your time to educate us on AI today. We will be sending a survey, so do please come back with your candid feedback about how we could improve and any thoughts on the presentation today. We'd be very eager to learn that. And please reach out if there's anything else that we can support you with in the context of diverse recruiting and retention of diverse talent. We're always eager to help. I think that there's been some huge takeaways. I know that some of my key ones were some encouragement around the rigorous auditing going on within the AI space. As I think about technology, I always think about it being very male dominated. So the knowledge that it's being done very much in cohesion with subject matter experts is extremely encouraging because that actually brings diversity into the mix. And also just hearing about the progress specifically around COVID-19, but the long journey to go and the work that's being done to really kind of drive this forward is really encouraging to me. So thank you again, really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us today. And we hope to see you again soon at one of our next programs.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.